As a rule, I'm not very interested in conspiracy theories. I know, shocking. As a guy who's constantly looking for the most plausible result to an event, the idea of the Illuminati, UFOs, or the government's plot to manipulate our cats as spies for the New World Order just isn't that convincing for me. However, I was looking around the web and I found this interesting thing called the Mandela effect. It's an issue in which large groups of people remember something that never happened. Most of this is innocuous, like saying the Monopoly Man had a monocle when he really didn't, or the childhood series being the Berenstein Bears rather than actually being the Berenstain Bears. However, the biggest example of this is that many people believe that Nelson Mandela died in the 80s and were shocked when he became a public figure in the 90s. There are countless crackpot theories, like we're traveling between slightly different dimensions inside our lifetimes, or some massive new world order is trying to manipulate the population. The Mandela effect is likely, however, just bad memory on a massive scale. But this got me thinking about how it would have affected history if Mandela had died in the 80s. A world in which this had happened would be quite different from the present, and is worth analyzing. So how would borders, culture, and the world today be different? In this timeline, Mandela dies of disease in 1981 in Robben Island prison. Honestly, the start of this timeline is kind of anticlimactic, and little happens for a few years, but to see the big picture of what's going to happen, we have to zoom out. Firstly, by the late 1980s, apartheid South Africa was in crisis and knew that a change had to come. Firstly, the lower birth rate meant that the white percentage of the population was declining. From its high point in the 30s of being over a third of the population, by 1991, the white population had declined to 13%. The rising black population simply made the maintenance of control appear less and less tenable. Secondly, the economic sanctions by the rest of the world were really biting. Finally, the Cold War had just ended. The United States was no longer worried about communism taking over the world. It would no longer support any Germanic Protestant nation that was kinda capitalist and kinda democratic, for hope that they would hold back red, black Africans. After the massive dark behemoth of the Soviet Union had fallen, the world's full attention and moral direction could fall on South Africa. Thus, no matter if the regime liked it or not, apartheid had to end somehow. Nelson Mandela's genius was that he was able to be a saintly moderate force that the whites were willing to hand power over to. Since this is Africa, in which ethnic wars erupt on the turn of a dime, and those turn into genocides quickly, whites were very wary about handing over power for fear of a race war. The ANC, or African National Congress, the party that Mandela was part of and has run South Africa since, was part terrorist organization, and Mandela was able to submerge that element in exchange for a more moderate position. Mandela was an incredible peacemaker, being in a position that wouldn't threaten the whites and kept the violent elements inside the ANC down. In this timeline, the whites would know that they would need to reform. However, there wouldn't be a clear good way forward. The pages of history are filled with countless oppressive regimes that collapsed when they tried to reform, whether it be the Soviet Union, pre-revolution France, or Qin dynasty China. In general, these organizations were only held together by their cruelty, and any loosening of that resulted in immediate unraveling. Mandela was able to generate an image of a South Africa that was manageable for everyone. Without the voice of compromise, it would give the apartheid regime little direction, and the conservative forces would thus dominate the discussion of reform. The main plan was to split the coloreds, a group with very different meaning in South Africa, being a mixed-race population of African, European, and Asian descent around the Cape, and the Asians of mainly Indian descent off as separate groups with different rights against the black Bantu majority. This would be too little too late, and the nation would likely collapse into civil war. The apartheid regime would be seen as weak, and the majority black population, seeing that the ruling regime was trying to change the system to permanently keep them down, would rebel. This would be one nasty war. This is the map of the racial breakdown of South Africa at the time. The ANC rebels would be drawing almost entirely from the majority Bantu population centered in the fertile northeast of the country. The base of power for the government would be the less Bantu Cape, and they would move their capital there to Cape Town. African wars tend to turn into ethnic and tribal struggles, in which century-old grudges get brought up in orgies of violence. This wouldn't only be centered on the whites. The Asians and coloreds were also disliked. The rise of black regimes in East Africa all resulted in the expulsion or suppression of their Indian populations, and the persecution of disliked tribes. The different enough coloreds would likely fall under this category. The white regime, fighting for its life, would form alliances with the coloreds and Asians, promising them equal rights in exchange for fighting with them. The Asians and coloreds, scared for their lives as well, would accept. A good comparison of a war happening at the same time would be Yugoslavia, in which centuries of Balkan tension and the unraveling of Serbian supremacy resulted in genocide and bloodbath. The war would of course be controversial in the West. We would see the same polarizing divisions as with every other war. The right would support the apartheid regime for being white Protestants, while ignoring the decades of oppression of other groups, while the left would support the rebels as freedom fighters, while ignoring them being thuggish and genocidal maniacs. In the end, the West would make the brave call of doing nothing and posing out how they were morally superior than their opponents. The Africans would have advantage of numbers, while the government would have an incredible superiority in military force by all measurements, whether technological or training. Using their vastly superior firepower, the government would be able to crush the riots in Cape Town and hold on to Johannesburg and Pretoria, which would be under siege, with massive amounts of protection being needed for the supply columns needed to feed them. There simply wouldn't be enough whites to hold on to the countryside of the Northeast, however. The 1990s were really into international morals and peace, so the United States, the sole global hegemon, would demand a treaty a year or two into the war. This would involve the division of South Africa in two, and the surrender of the northeastern cities to the rebels. We would see a front line developing something like this, with the east of the country becoming an independent black nation run out of Johannesburg, with its name of course changed to something more African, while the west would become a mixed-race nation based out of Cape Town. These two nations would obviously hate each other and would develop very differently. Let's start with the Western nation. The best comparison would be Northern Ireland's during the Troubles. To survive, the governing regime would give complete political rights to Asians and coloreds. There would be a significant Bantu minority in the Cape that would be oppressed through either flat-out legal discrimination or a series of subtle techniques that would in effect keep them powerless. There would be a large terrorist movement inside the Cape, covertly sponsored by the Johannesburg government to gain South African unity. Large numbers of whites, and especially Asians, whose center would be in Durban, part of the Bantu nation, would flee to the Cape. The economy would also be like the north of Ireland. Due to the apartheid caste system, everyone with economic skill, education, and training would have left for the Cape, giving it a pretty well-developed economy. However, the instability, the uncompetitiveness of the South African economy in general, in distance from other economic centers, would give it a stagnant economy. It would, however, likely be a hub for the African region. For these reasons, they would likely have a suicide rate to match Northern Ireland's. It would be an unpleasant place to live. The black nation would be even worse off. A prescient example would be Zimbabwe, which was the white-run Rhodesia beforehand. The racial caste system meant that non-whites had little education or economic training, meaning that when the white population was evicted, the economy tanked and Zimbabwe became one of the poorest nations on earth. The black Africans, seeing how rich the white ruling class used to be, would demand welfare systems the state simply could not afford. This would result in hyperinflation of the currency, and thus a further collapse of the economy. Finally, only the most thuggish leadership rose in the wars of liberation, in Zimbabwe's case, Mugabe, who was one of the worst dictators of our lifetime, rose to power. We can expect a similar fate for Bantu South Africa in this timeline. So I hope this video made you guys appreciate Nelson Mandela more and understand simply how delicate history is. It's figures like him that deny history and make the world a better place. Also, I hope this sheds light on the Mandela effect, since a world in which people remembered Mandela dying in the 80s is a world in which South Africa would be split in two. What if Altist, thank you for watching. Sorry this video took so long, guys, but I've been having Wi-Fi issues and issues with my software that I need to replace, and so, thanks for waiting, and if you enjoyed this video, please comment, subscribe, stay tuned for future content, or support me on Patreon, and thanks for watching and have a good day.